Time for our Entre Nous segment next, and today marks the Global Day of Action for the Right to Strike, and we're joined in the studio by Florence Villeminot to take a closer look at striking culture around the world, and in particular here in France. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Delano. And full disclosure, I did not know that February 18th is the Global Day of Action for the Right to Strike. It must be said there are so many of these international days, between No Elevators Day on April 24th and Fascination of Plants Day on May 18th.
Really?
It's very hard to keep track of these international days, but mark it in your calendar, February 18th. Now, you'd be forgiven for not knowing about this one because it's actually kind of a new kid on the block. It was designated such a day 10 years ago, so back in 2015, by the International Trade Union Confederation, which says that the right to strike is under threat around the world.
Now, Flo, there is no international law guaranteeing that anyone has the right to strike. It depends on individual countries, doesn't it?
It does, and there's some countries where striking is not permitted. For instance, in North Korea, same in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Now, for countries where striking is permitted, striking culture is very different. For instance, in Japan, people who go on strike tend to actually work on their strike days. They'll wear, an armband, or they'll put up a sign saying that they're on strike, but otherwise it's business as usual. And where striking is permitted, striking culture is also a shifting thing. For instance, in the United States, after years of decline, there are more and more strikes. We've been covering them here on the news. Recently you had the Hollywood writers, the dockers, Amazon workers, all these different workers going on strikes in the United States. So kind of a shift of culture there.
Dock workers too. What's the situation like here in France? Because this country has a well-known reputation for striking all the time. Some would say it's even the national pastime. But is it just a stereotype?
Well, like many stereotypes, there is a part of truth in the fact that French people go on strike quite a lot. There is this joke that it's as you said, a national pastime. It does get a lot of attention, and proof of how important it is in France. It's actually enshrined in the French Constitution. The right to strike is a constitutional right in France, and it's actually relatively easy to go on strike in France. For instance, you don't have to be part of a trade union. You can still go on strike.
Now, some would say that there's a striking culture in this country. Where does this tendency really come from?
Well, it might actually come down to French history, and this is something that's quite particular to France, is that the right to strike was actually one of the very first social rights acquired by the French. This was way back in 1864, and they acquired this right 20 years before they acquired the right to join a trade union. And so this 20-year time gap actually might have been part of what created a culture of workplace power struggles here in France. Because in other European countries, for instance, you'll negotiate first and then strike if talks collapse. Whereas here in France, it's the opposite. You strike first and then you talk. That's the order of things. Just listen to Jean-Claude Mailly, the former head of the trade union Force Ouvrière. Now, it might not be surprising for a trade union. He says a lot of it has to do with the government.
Il y a une culture du rapport de force, oui. L'État a toujours été assez directif, voire autoritaire, et qu'il accepte mal finalement la négociation. L'État ne négocie pas avec ses fonctionnaires. Il les consulte et il prend une décision, par exemple.
But Flo, if you look at the figures, it appears France's striking reputation isn't necessarily well-deserved.
The results are striking, as you said. That being said, it's really hard to actually pull together figures that you can compare because there are no standardized figures. But what is true, though, is that there is this reputation that striking is part of the French DNA. It is certainly part of our cultural heritage. There is a national glorification somewhat of citizens who,
take to the streets,
rise up to fight against the man. I mean, you just have to think about the French Revolution. Perhaps this is where this whole, contestation started in the first place.
Now, in recent history, the biggest social uprisings and general strikes seems to happen around May 1968.
May 1968. If you've spent any time in France, you've definitely heard about May 1968. It's considered really a turning point in French society and has definitely contributed to this myth that France is the land of the strike. We often talk about the students protesting, but there was actually a massive general strike in France. It really touched the whole country. And perhaps this is why France is still associated with this. Listen to Daniel Cohn-Bendit. So he was one of the student leaders at the time, and here he is reflecting on the legacy of May 1968. You'll see, it's very interesting what he has to say.
Il y a eu des révoltes partout, mais une grève générale, il n'y a eu qu'en France. Donc c'est une spécialité made in France. 68, c'est typiquement, dans la version française, made in France. Les Français se gargarisent et disent on a été formidable, c'était extraordinaire. Et de plus, on a été les meilleurs.
Flo, some may say that the French have striking down to a fine art. It's all about creating inconvenience and making sure you're seen.
That's right. And that might explain why people feel that strikes happen all the time in France. And it's because they're very, very annoying if you have to get around, for instance. They can cause a lot of disruption. You can see these poor people stuck in the metro. This is something that we have definitely went through several times in the French capital. They get a lot of attention in the media because they're so disruptive. You know, transport strikes, but also, air controllers, etc. People hear about them. And not only that, but when people go on strike in France, they protest as well. This is another French specialty, I guess you could say, la manifestation. They protest loudly. And there's a certain aesthetic to demonstrations in France. I mean, what demonstration is this? We don't even know. They all kind of tend to look alike. And so you might be forgiven for thinking, okay, people on strike, but what are they even striking about this time?
Now, the reputation of France as being a nation of strikers can be costly to businesses and foreign investors. But what's fascinating is that no matter how disruptive they are, it seems they always tend to get the public support.
They do. It's really surprising. The general public tends to have, an acceptance for strikes. It's just part of life here in France. It's a necessary evil, I guess you could say, for the common good. Because even if they themselves aren't striking, people tend to have a certain respect for people who are defending their rights, defending social rights. These are called les acquis sociaux, hard-earned social gains here in France. And so, France has a very generous protective system, the sécurité sociale, for instance. Healthcare, all these things. It didn't just fall from the sky. People have been protesting and striking to protect them over and over. And so the French tend to just grin and bear it because these strikes do happen a lot. We talked about strikes recently over the pension reform, but before that, there were the transport strikes in 2019. There were other strikes in 1995. Time and time again, French people just accept this as a part of life. That being said, there are still people who complain about it because it's France after all.
Je trouve ça d'une bêtise, quoi. C'est-à-dire le pays commence un peu à sortir de la misère. Qu'est-ce qu'on va faire pour leur plonger dans la misère? Enfin, voilà. On dirait que les Français sont devenus des demeurés.
Là, j'ai vraiment pas de transport pour aller au boulot. J'ai pris le RER jusqu'ici, mais il n'y a pas de métro, il n'y a pas de bus. Ben, je vais aller à pied.
Est-ce que vous comprenez cette grève aujourd'hui à la RATP?
Oui, parce que sans grève, il n'y a rien. S'ils veulent avoir quelque chose, il faut faire ça. Bon, c'est pénible pour nous, mais il faut assumer.
Sans grève, il n'y a rien.
Exactly.
Without strikes, you have nothing.
Exactly. I think the woman at the end put it best. Thank you very much for that, Flo. Flo Villeminot there joining us on Entre Nous today.